Dutch politics is a response to events abroad, usually. Since 2008, Dutch politics has been shaped by the global financial crisis, then by the Euro crisis, by the pandemic, by the migrant crisis of 2015. So you have this very large centre that just has to respond to what happens abroad, always with an eye over its shoulder at the extreme right, worrying that it will go above 20%, which it never has. And that's sort of the context of Dutch politics, whoever is the government.
In 2011, Francis Fukuyama described the problem of creating modern political institutions as one of, quote-unquote, getting to Denmark. The country, in his own words at the time, was a mythical place known for its stable, democratic, peaceful, prosperous, and inclusive institutions, virtually free of any political corruption. A few miles south of Denmark lie the Netherlands, a country that just last week renewed Mark Rutte's mandate to lead a government coalition, albeit from a somewhat reshuffled parliamentary landscape this time. Our two guests this week will highlight a gradual shift in the core of Dutch politics towards a new blend of fiscal hawkishness, moderate Euroscepticism, and even a somewhat less liberal social policy than has been the Dutch norm. No other country, however, has in our judgment journeyed further into the emergence of the proverbial third way and the technocratization of vast swaths of government policy. Simon Kuper of the Financial Times and Rem Korteweg of the Clingendael Institute will walk us through the Fukuyamaesque clichés that may have been borne out in this latest election, whilst at the same time giving due warning that not everything is as may rosily seem in the Dutch Low Countries. Enjoy the episode.
We are so glad to have with us two seasoned observers of Dutch politics and society. Simon Kupe is a veteran columnist at the Financial Times, who's covered nearly every topic you can think of, from sports to currency, and is a long-time follower of all things Dutch, from its football to its language. He's the author of Spies, Lies, and Exile in Russia, the extraordinary story of George Blake, on the infamous Soviet spy George Blake. Rem Korteweg is a senior research fellow at the Clingendael Institute, where you cover, among other things, foreign policy, trade, and poor you Brexit. Rem was a former policy advisor to the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So let's get into it. This election, I think is fair to say, is a triumph for Mark Rutte. He's been the Prime Minister for the past 11 years. He struggled with more coalitions than anyone I can think of, with parties on the right, parties on the left, parties on the centre. He survived the 2008 crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, the migration waves of 2015, and now he comfortably wins the election despite COVID-19 and political scandals. We call him Teflon Mark for a reason, but why does he owe that success? After 11 years in office, is there also some kind of agenda we can pinpoint to retrospectively? And how do you think his legacy is shaping up? Maybe Rem first.
Well, I think, first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. Mark Rutte is an exceptional politician to the extent that he rightly deserves the label of being Teflon Mark. It doesn't really matter what you throw at him. Apparently, it doesn't stick. I mean, these elections took place in the context of a major benefit scandal, which harmed thousands of Dutch citizens. And that all happened under his watch. But when you look at the election result, it didn't really matter. In fact, the two parties that were most responsible for bringing this benefit scandal to the fore actually suffered in the polls and lost seats. So why is this? And if there's one way to describe Mark Rutte, it's that he's a very pragmatic, tactical operator, more like a manager rather than a big visionary politician. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But he just does really well in the short game of politics. And I think also he's not squeamish about sacrificing his own. So when you look at how many ministers from his own party actually resigned or who were forced to resign because of scandals that surrounded his government, I think it's quite telling that he's still there, almost at Olympian heights, and the rest is just kind of suffering that his success.
And Simon, do you think it's fair to say there's something Merkel-esque about Rutte to some extent?
I think, as with Germany, you've got to look at the longer term and see that, like German chancellors, Dutch prime ministers tend to serve a very long time with very high levels of public approval. So since 1982, there's only been 4 prime ministers. And that's also the period that the Dutch economy has done very well for much of that time, 1981 to 2007. I think there was a world record GDP growth, unbroken 26 years. So the Netherlands is a fairly easy country to be prime minister of if you're, as Rem says, Rutte is, a manager, somebody without great ideals, without great visions, who just says, I'm going to sit somewhere near the center of politics, run the large coalition. In the Netherlands, there always is quite a large coalition of centrist parties, of center left, center right, and just not try and do anything very ambitious, which Dutch voters don't want. I mean, this is a country with very high levels of contentment. In happiness surveys, the Netherlands is usually near the top of the world. Even during the pandemic, people rate their happiness, and this is constantly studied in the Netherlands, with somewhere between 7 and 8 out of 10. And so there is a demand for a prime minister who is just a manager. I think you need to see the Dutch prime minister as sort of the chief civil servant. And Dutch policy is pre-cooked by the civil service, by academic advisors, by trade unions sitting down with employers. So there isn't a huge room for maneuver. So yes, Rutte is the man who manages the process.
And so we just had the election right now, and we say that Mark Rutte is the big winner. But more generally, who are the big winners and losers of the election alongside Rutte and his VVD party? And it's a bit early for this because coalition building in the Netherlands is famously a very long process. But what kind of coalition can we expect to see to emerge out of this parliament?
I think there's been 3 clear winners this election and 1 very clear loser. First of all, I mean, Mark Rutte is a winner, and it's worth emphasizing that it's Mark Rutte that won, not necessarily his VVD party. The campaign was all about him. The VVD's campaign strategy revolved all around him as being the safe pair of hands, the prime minister in charge of the country in a moment of crisis. It is really to his credit. Now, a second winner is the D66 Liberal Democrats. Actually, they gained more seats than the VVD won. And they've now gone from being the number 3 party to the number 2 party, which puts them in a very comfortable position to help shape a next coalition. The third winner, or group of winners, if you will, is the Eurosceptic bloc. We've seen, alongside Geert Wilders, who many of your listeners will arguably know, we've seen the success of Thierry Baudet and his Forum for Democracy, who went from 2 to 8 seats. And we've seen a third populist right-wing copycat party emerging under the number of Ja 21, which is an abbreviation for the correct answer 21, which they're kind of a standard run-of-the-mill Eurosceptic populist right-wing party. So now it's 3 parties, and together they have achieved a number of seats, which we haven't seen at any time in recent history. So they have 28 seats, about 18% of the population voted for them. So those are the 3 clear winners. Now, who's the loser? I think it's fair to say that the left lost. Left-wing parties did very poorly. They did poorly, whether you look at Social Democrats, who weren't able to improve on their very dramatic result at the polls in 2017. They suffered a 75% vote loss in 2017, and they stayed at the same level this time around. The Green Party, GroenLinks, they saw their seat numbers half. Socialist Party did very poorly. So what you can say is that Dutch politics has really moved to the right in this election. There isn't really a left-wing opposition to speak of. 15 years ago, the left-wing parties had 65 seats in parliament. They're now down to 25. And so there's something happening in terms of Dutch politics, that we've shifted to the right. At the same time, it's worth emphasizing again that the Eurosceptics did well, but so did the pro-European parties. So there's a new cleavage running, I think, through Dutch politics, which suggests that Europe is another issue we should be monitoring closely in a Dutch context.
And Simon, I'm no expert on coalition building, but I would expect the bad news for VVD is you probably want to be the kind of central party within a coalition. Isn't there a risk that the future coalition would lean a bit too far to the left for Rutte's comfort?
I mean, I think it's difficult to talk about right and left when it comes to the parties in the coalition in the Netherlands, because for the last decade, the parties on the extreme right are not considered coalition material. Wilders supported the coalition until 2012. That's unlikely to happen again. And the parties of the left, beyond the centre left, have also been excluded. So you get always a coalition of various centrist parties, and you can say, well, VVD is centre right, and D66 is maybe centre left or centre. But these differences are really quite small. It's hard for outsiders to perceive big differences, especially because you then get 4 or 5 parties together. So the differences start to fade. It makes more sense to think of it as one large centrist party that is always governing, with tiny nuances to right and left, which don't matter that much because Dutch politics is a response to events abroad usually. So since 2008, Dutch politics has been shaped by the global financial crisis, then by the Euro crisis, by the pandemic, by the migrant crisis of 2015. So you have this very large center that just has to respond to what happens abroad, and always with an eye over its shoulder at the extreme right, worrying that it will go above 20%, which it never has. And that's sort of the context of Dutch politics, whoever is the government.
Right. So let's parse out kind of the trajectories of each of these specific parties and set them in the wider context of the past 20 to 30 years. And, it was so coincidental. I was reading this morning a political science text looking at, what political scientists call realignments. And D66, which has now, it seems like, has greater leverage over any possible coalition that will emerge out of VVD. This particular text looked at D66 as a case study of a party that was kind of ahead of its own game and kind of carving out this new socially liberal, elite, cosmopolitan niche within the spectrum, and again, that was way ahead of anything that was to happen in other European countries decades after that, right? The sort of the Tony Blair third way and other socially liberal cosmopolitan parties of that nature. Speaking of getting to Holland, or the sort of end of history bearing out in the supply side of the party system, what do you think the D66's trajectory over the years tells about Dutch life and Dutch society as a whole? Is it's also very striking, as one of you has alluded to already, that the aggregate number of seats that the left can pull together is also at all-time lows. They seem to have this sort of gentleman's agreement where they will only accept to be part of negotiations if the Social Democrats and the Greens come into it together, right? And it seems like the Social Democrats are no longer sort of a big player. And what does that tell about Dutch society? One of you has alluded the cleavage shifting to the right, the epicenter shifting to the right. Where's the lefty electorate? Where's the middle to lower class, welfare-minded electorate? Is there a shift of that electorate towards the hard right in much the same way that we've seen, for instance, in France, where the hardcore left electorate is now more prone to voting for the hard right candidate?
Very briefly, the Netherlands is much more than most in Europe an overwhelmingly middle-class nation now, with high levels of education. So there is a shrinking working class, if you identify it by education, say, a lot of it which does vote for Wilders. But really, these successful parties have more middle class electorates like D66 and VVD. So, this is not France in that way.
Yeah, I'd add that one of the features of D66's success this time around is that they were able to absorb a lot of voters that otherwise tended to vote for Social Democrats or GroenLinks or even the socialists. And so you could argue that the success of D66 is the loss collectively of the left. And this is a problem that D66 is going to confront in the coalition formation process, because it wants to build a coalition together with a number of left-wing parties, perhaps at least one, to offset the right-wing pull of the VVD. But they're not really there anymore because all those voters have moved to D66 this time around. I think it's worth underlining that the Dutch are notoriously undecided and disloyal in their voting allegiance. So up until a week before the election, about 70% of the electorate was undecided, and so it's very difficult to draw clear-cut conclusions that what happened this time around is also a guarantee for elections 4 years down the road. But I think it's true. I think that what you mentioned, Jorge, that there is a move in some groups that traditionally voted for, say, the Socialist Party, that all of a sudden the anti-immigrant rhetoric of Wilders or even Forum for Democracy sounds quite appealing. So there is some bleeding of the hard left towards the hard right. But I think this time around, the dominant trend has been that Sigrid Kaag, the leader of the D66 party, really had the momentum at some point and was able to suck dry support for other center left and harder left wing parties.
Yeah, just to say why D66, I think it's partly because they distinguish themselves by being aggressively pro-European and saying the Netherlands has to behave like an EU member state and think of itself that way. And that was a rare offering because most of the other centrist parties had shied away from that. And you see that also in the success of the small Europhile party Volt. So there is a Dutch electorate, a minority electorate of say 20% plus, that is much more pro-European than the group represented by Rutte.
I think that's true, but where I think a number of left-wing parties really made a mistake is that they had this gentleman's agreement, and no one knows what this gentleman's agreement means. I mean, you already see the maneuverings by both the Social Democrats and GroenLinks separately to want to go into bed with the VVD and D66 in the coalition formation talks. But this assumption that if you vote for one of these parties, actually the other has to do very well as well. Otherwise, your vote is simply lost because they've already announced that they would only go into government together, I think was an obstacle when the other proposition is Sigrid Kaag, who presented herself as different leadership. I mean, that was her slogan. And she did that from a position of being in the government. So for undecided voters that are sort of center-left or progressive, the Kaag pitch, aside from Simon is correct, the pro-EU factor mattered, although that wasn't something she was campaigning heavily on. The notion that she was the only progressive inside government and actually said, well, this is where I want to be, and I'm not going to make any type of gentleman's agreement that's going to confine my options in any coalition formation process. I think that also helped give her that credibility that if you vote for her, that's going to deliver in terms of governing power.
Just a precision for our viewers, Kaag is the leader of D66. She's a former diplomat.
Well, this is all tremendously useful, and let's try to shift the focus here to the some of the internecine battles that are going on the hard right. There always seem to be this sort of gulf between the deplorable hard right that Wilders represents, right, in terms of the anti-Islam rhetoric that has come to define his party, and the more respectable fringe of the hard right, which is a mantle that has been increasingly picked up by Thierry Baudet's party, notwithstanding the recent series of scandals. And so it seems like these two rather different persuasions are claiming the mantle of, the Pinford twin, right? Persuasion, right? A sort of civilizationalist right that is also, very fiscally hawkish and Eurosceptic. But I wonder, how that end of the spectrum is faring in this particular context. I mean, there does seem, and following Thierry Baudet's series of comments that were taken to be anti-Semitic, and wondering kind of what your thoughts are on that. But it seems like there's still that gap that may be very hard to bridge. A series of members, particularly in the European Parliament, but a series of members of Baudet's party were very quick to leave, to desert the Forum for Democracy, and are now the kind of the vanguard of JA21. And though in that sort of persuasion, a more sort of techno populist almost politics, that seems very far away from Geert Wilders, right? So what's that coalition looking like? It seems like there's a very wide spectrum of voters that can be, that can see eye to eye on most of the issues, but the supply side of the party system is giving them just this mosaic of parties. What's that part of the spectrum looking like in your view? Whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll go first. So it's quite fascinating what's happening on the hard right. So you have Wilders, who still comes in third. He's the third largest party at the moment. He lost 3 seats. Most of those seats actually went to Thierry Baudet. They are kind of each other's yin and yang. So the one's support is the other's loss, and they've been kind of interchangeable in terms of getting the hard right vote. And Simon already alluded to the fact that, give or take a couple of percentage points, support for Eurosceptic populist right-wing parties is rather stable. It sort of gravitates between 15 and 20% of the electorate. And if you go back into history over the past couple of elections, the PVV at some point had 24 seats by itself. Now the 3 parties, the 3 Eurosceptic parties amongst them, have 28. So it's not a huge difference. What was interesting to watch during this campaign, however, is that Geert Wilders and Thierry Baudet had very different campaign strategies. So Wilders was emphasizing, everyone was talking about the corona crisis, of course, but he was emphasizing the fact that healthcare was underfunded, that Mark Rutte was sending billions to bail out southern European countries that could otherwise be used to help our healthcare. And of course, he was making the anti-immigrant pitch. Thierry Baudet went full on corona conspiracy. He started to make this case that corona doesn't exist. It's not worse than the flu. The vaccines are a hoax. He was taking a leaf from Donald Trump's playbook to the degree that he was saying, look, we need to simply open up. He was promoting a freedom caravan as part of his campaign tour. He's the only politician who actually did rallies. He was able to bring people, despite the corona lockdown, to these platforms, to his bus that he was driving through the country. And he really became this anti-corona voice, which was weird to see, because initially he surrounded himself again by anti-vaxxers and then conspiracy thinkers. And at a certain moment, you saw that entrepreneurs and business owners who felt that all the other parties that were making the case about, okay, we need to take a sensible approach to the corona crisis, we need to preserve the healthcare system, that if you felt that wasn't going fast enough, if you felt that your business was wrongfully closed, or that you were an entrepreneur and you were hurting, that actually became a quite attractive sell. So oddly enough, you see that entrepreneurs are among the category of voters that tended to vote for Thierry Baudet. And even though, despite, I mean, what you were mentioning, despite the fact that in November, when all those issues came to the fore regarding the tweets and the WhatsApp messages and the anti-Semitic undertone in a lot of the communication, he collapsed in the polls, and so he was still able to deliver a very strong result on being the only pure hardcore anti-corona campaigner.
I think with right-wing populists, the personality of the leader is very important in signaling what the party is. And Wilders, I mean, he has, he's had death threats from Islamists, so he sort of stands for an aggressive no to Islam, but he appeals to a working class electorate, the so-called left behinds, who of course in the Netherlands are much less left behind than in the UK, US, or France. And Baudet stands for, he tries to embody the superiority of Western civilization. So he's always quoting big books and thinkers who he may or may not have read. And he talks about his own good looks, and he sort of stands for a Netherlands which is better, is a superior culture to non-Western cultures. And so that appeals, also male supremacy. So he does a lot of kind of misogynistic sex talk about women. So he appeals to that kind of constituency of men, particularly, who believe that men and the West are better. And so it's a slightly different appeal than Wilders. But I mean, it's now become a protest vote, the far right, because I think 20 years ago when it emerged in the Netherlands, we believed it could one day be at the heart of government. That possibility seems to be receding now. And I think a lot of their voters vote for them, not expecting them to get into government. It's a sort of protest vote. And I suspect that many Wilders voters, for example, are quite happy that a sort of dour manager like Rutte is in charge rather than an excitable shouter like Wilders. So you vote for Wilders in order to get Rutte, I think, is the motivation for some of the people.
Yeah. And if I'm allowed just a quick follow up for either of you, actually, if you've got any sort of intel that you can share on this, but I think a lot of people outside of the Netherlands are curious just to know how this whole anti-Semitic or just the whole like conspiracist row with all these leaks that came out of, I think, a series of WhatsApp chats, right? How all that is playing out with the electorate. It seems like, it's always very heartening to see an electorate that is just that has embraced this sort of zero tolerance with anti-Semitism. It seems like the anti-Semitism really interplays in this particular case with just the COVID conspiracies, right? It seems like some of the WhatsApp messages alluded to COVID itself being a sort of George Soros conspiracy, which on top of being rather anti-Semitic, it is also just absolute nuts, right? And so I wonder kind of how we tend to have this image of Amsterdam historically being an epicenter and a capital of Judaism historically, right? A lot of Sephardic influence, a lot of interesting commerce, exchange of ideas going on in Amsterdam with other European capitals that was channeled through a major Dutch Jewish families, and so I wonder if that's playing into the zero tolerance that we've seen Dutch society oppose to this particular row. Is there anything you'd like to share about this particular case specifically?
I mean, it's not zero tolerance. He did win a few seats. I mean, a large part of his small electorate has stayed loyal, even though apart from being anti-Semitic, he's shown himself to be very unstable. I think that in Dutch discourse, as in the US, as in France, the word Jew has come to connote, in the minds of anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists, a kind of small cultural elite in Amsterdam, in this case, that has undue power, etc. And so it's a kind of shortcut way. The word Jew is a shortcut way of referring to being anti-elitist. And of course, it is in itself anti-Semitic, but it also is a code word for the Dutch elite.
I think what's interesting in this context is that because of the WhatsApp messages, because of the outcry from within his party, the likely coalition partners, if any, like the VVD or even the Christian Democrats, were very quickly to rule out going into a coalition with Thierry Baudet, and that just reinforced what Simon was alluding to, that like Wilders, Baudet is now a protest party. But, and this is where I think it's interesting, as this scandal erupted inside Forum for Democracy, there was a splinter party that emerged, which is Ya 21. Now, they're supposedly the acceptable face of right-wing populism. It was founded by the Baudet confidants, the number 3, 4, and 5 on the electoral list, that said, this is enough. We can't stomach these WhatsApp messages anymore. We can stomach, of course, all the other crazy stuff that's coming out of this party, like the anti-immigrant line or the anti-EU line and whatnot. But that apparently was the straw that broke the camel's back, and they're now really presenting themselves as this. Well, we're responsible. We're responsible radical rights. And interestingly enough, Rutte, in these coalition formation talks, actually pitched having negotiations with them first to explore whether a coalition would be possible. Now, I think that it's almost 100% guaranteed that that's not going to work. I don't think the D66 constituency would accept doing a coalition deal with Ya 21, but it's quite interesting to see that Christian Democrats, D66, VVD all ruled out explicitly not doing a deal with Geert Wilders and Thierry Baudet, but they have never said as such regarding Ya 21. Perhaps because they didn't think Ya 21 would get into Parliament and win 3 seats, the 3 seats that are probably necessary to get to a majority. But now that we're there, Ya 21 is an interesting sort of power factor to take into consideration about what's going to happen in these coalition formation talks.
So it's a nice segue into the question of Europe and the Netherlands' position in it, because historically, obviously, the Netherlands is a founding member of the EU, but it was arguably a kind of a small country compared to European giants like Germany, France, or the UK. And with Brexit, meaning the UK left, and Germany mellowing its stance on fiscal integration, the Dutch stance on this issue of fiscal integration has seemed to harden up a bit, or at least it's been much more forceful. And we've seen coalition building, the so-called Hanseatic League, the Frugal Four, all these coalitions on those issues, which have created a lot of bad bloods with other capitals, mainly Paris. So is there a feeling that the Dutch haven't quite adjusted to their new status they have nowadays? And could this change with D66's performance? Because there's been a lot of optimism about D66 performance in Europe, especially among kind of more pro-European figures. But is this going to change fundamentally the way the Netherlands approaches its relationship to the EU? Usually, the finance ministry ends up going into the hands of a second largest party, which in this case would be D66. But does the fact that they are quote unquote pro-European change the balance of power, or are we kind of misunderstanding what being pro-European means in the Netherlands? Rem, if you have any few comments on the kind of change of status of the Netherlands, and if you expect a change in policy with D66 arrival.
I think this is particularly if you're sort of in Brussels or watching EU politics, this is the $64,000 question, that which way would a Rutte 4 administration lean on Europe, given the relative victory of D66? I think there are reasons to be optimistic, in the sense that the tone from the Dutch government is likely to change. I think you would expect a new government to be much more open to European cooperation. But having said that, I don't think a lot is going to change in terms of substance. I was just reading this afternoon the letter that leader of D66, Sigrid Kaag, sent to the group that's trying to explore a new coalition, and in which she sort of outlined her priorities. It's very vague language on European cooperation, sort of saying we need more European cooperation and we need a strong monetary union. Well, actually, Mark Rutte agrees with 100% of that. The problem is, of course, how you deliver a stronger monetary union. And Rutte will say, well, primarily the responsibility for that lies with individual member states. The individual member states need to reform and need to make adjustments to their fiscal policies, and it's not up to the European Commission to fix that. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know how you want to explain it, but Kaag is not being very specific on that point, leaving a lot of wiggle room in any new coalition agreement. And that connects with, I think, a broader structural point about Dutch politics, is that, sure, D66 might get the Ministry of Finance, but will that really change the politics? I don't think that we're going to see something like happened in 2018 in Germany, where after a period of the Ministry of Finance being in the hands of the CDU under Wolfgang Schäuble, a SPD-run finance ministry all of a sudden really did an about-face on European and Eurozone solidarity. I wouldn't expect that. I think there are structural reasons why the Dutch Ministry of Finance is going to stay pretty much doing what it does right now, driving a fairly hard bargain on monetary union issues. I think it's also to the point that I think Simon already mentioned, that our political leaders are more managers or are more chaperones, and that the policy is really driven at the level of the civil service. So the tone might change. That's what politicians are generally for in the Netherlands, but I wouldn't expect huge changes on substance.
I mean, they lost the battle over, reconstruction funds going to in large quantities to countries like Italy. So we mustn't overestimate this power that they have, that they've fully replaced Britain. I mean, I agree with them. I don't see a huge change in terms of the management of the Eurozone. I think what you must look out for is the Netherlands pushing against Poland and Hungary. There's a lot of Dutch discontentment about these two countries not obeying the rule of law, but at the same time getting a lot of European funds. And I think the Netherlands might find more sympathy with a country like France by pushing against Poland and Hungary rather than against Italy in its next move.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting one. That's a very interesting thing to explain, Simon. I do appreciate that. We've got this sort of vague sense in the wake of the whole rule of law spat that happened a few months back prior to the Christmas break, when countries coming around the EU Council, when all these negotiations were happening around the COVID relief package. There wasn't, I think, enough transparency as to who exactly was driving this rule of law hardline approach to Poland and Hungary, and it seems retrospectively like whether it is just a cover for the fiscal hawkishness of the Dutch government, or if there's sort of a deeper argument there about we've got this set of so-called European values that all EU member states should abide by, and we can't tolerate judiciaries in Central Europe veering away from independence and that sort of thing. So I do appreciate that clarity. If there's anything else about why specifically, it seems like the rule of law hardliner coalition was made up primarily of Holland, but also I think some of the Nordic countries, right? Like Sweden. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think there's a couple of things to point out about this. First of all, when you think about the Netherlands and its role in the European Union, don't get hung up on one coalition. In the sense that the Hanseatic League, or the Frugal Four, was the dominant prism through which outsiders looked at the Netherlands over the past couple of years. And that gave the impression that the Netherlands is this northern stingy creditor country that just wants to sit on its money. The problem with that, however, is if you look at different areas of EU policy, for instance, on rule of law, there are different coalitions emerging. There was like you say, I mean, with France, there was a huge amount of commonality when it comes to addressing rule of law. The reason why the Dutch do that is because there's sort of this legalism in our DNA that rule of law is holy, but there's also a practical mercantile element to it, that if you want the single market to function, which the Netherlands desperately wants, then it makes sense to have transparent judiciary procedures that you can trust, that you can rely on. And so, rule of law in the context of the role of the judiciary played into this broader idea, at least that's the way in which it was framed domestically, that it's important to have decent rule of law procedures to allow the single market, which ultimately is the holy grail from Rutte's perspective about what the EU is for, to allow this single market to function. And I can mention another couple of coalitions that might be somewhat surprising if you only focus on the Netherlands as, again, the leader of the Hanseatics or the Frugals. There's a joint Spanish-Dutch non-paper on strategic autonomy coming out. The French and the Dutch published a non-paper on trade and sustainability, which is direct input in terms of shaping the EU's new trade strategy. The Dutch and the French were very closely aligned on Brexit in terms of hammering on this issue of the level playing field guarantee. The Dutch themselves drove a very hard, though they didn't drive a hard bargain, but they made this very clear statement that for them, it's not all about liberalism, and introduced an element of investment screening into the single market by making it more difficult for outside countries, primarily China, to invest in the single market if it wasn't clear to what degree those investments were connected to state-owned enterprises. And so there's the Netherlands likes these fluctuating ad hoc coalitions depending on circumstances. It echoes with how we started to talk about the Netherlands as under Rutte's leadership as being sort of pragmatic, as being a manager, and not being vested into big new projects, but also not putting all its eggs in one basket. I think that's typical of Rutte and the Netherlands at this moment.
So one last comment before we leave. Simon, you made a very strong case in Financial Times that the reason the Dutch voters like Rutte, something we've covered here, is that while he's not the most brilliant manager, he presents himself as just a manager who isn't animated by any delusions of a day. Rutte often quotes former West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, anyone having visions should see a doctor. And it seems like the Dutch mostly agree. Are the Dutch the last Fukuyaman country left standing, sipping by the side of people fighting out while they enjoy the end of history?
Well, I mean, if you go to the Netherlands, there's all sorts of whining about all sorts of issues, often about trains or about. So, on a day-to-day basis, the newspapers are full of whining, but it's usually quite small stuff. The country I grew up in until Pim Fortuyn came along in 2002 was immensely self-contented and saw itself as sort of a guideland, a phrase of Dutch politics in the 1970s, which would show the way to unenlightened countries like the US or the Soviet Union or Uganda or whatever. And so we had perfected the world. Then Pim Fortuyn comes along, very rowdy populist, kind of first of the breed in 2002, and shouts about all these, the Netherlands is in ruins, things are terrible. He was then shot dead by an animal rights activist, but that kind of lingered, this kind of voice of protest, which was later taken up by Wilders. And so after Fortuyn, you did have a decade of a lot of loud shouting and complaining. That seems to have died away, and I think most of the population is back at the contentment of the 70s and 80s. And, having lived in many other countries in my life, if I lived in the Netherlands, I'd be very contented with the system. It seems to me one of the least bad political systems and places to live in the history of the world. Apart from the terrible weather, things function very smoothly. Levels of equality are quite high. Levels of income are high. Being Dutch is a pretty good thing. And that's why being Dutch Prime Minister is one of the easiest jobs in world politics.
So, Rem, what do you think? Do you think the Dutch are the lucky few who have reached the end of history?
Oh, wow. I very much enjoy sort of Simon's analysis because it makes me feel good about where I am at the moment. I'm not sure Dutch politicians would agree, but neither should we expect them to. So, I mean, I think that our politics um, is quite interesting at the moment, despite the fact that it was a very predictable result. That again, we have Rutte in his fourth term. I think there are big problems, however, that need to be addressed that we really don't have a solution to. I think the climate agenda is a pretty tough one, also for a country like the Netherlands, which relies on pretty carbon intensive industries for its prosperity. For the Dutch to solve, I think immigration is a huge issue in the Netherlands, like it is in other countries. Don't get me wrong, but I think um, Simon's analysis is probably right from a comparative perspective, but when you're in the middle of it, these issues like climate, like migration, tend to be very quite explosive. And I'm not ruling out at all that we're going to have um, more sort of testing political times ahead. Also for this new government.
Well, if I remember my Fukuyama correctly, he says at the end the risk is that out of boredom comes new forces of agitation. Thank you both to Rem and Simon for coming on the show, for covering the recent election, the triumph of Mark Rutte, the rise of the liberal European D66, and the implications this has for the rest of Europe. I think this has been a fascinating overview. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Rem.
So, Simon and Rem around. What did you think of this episode, Francois?
It was great. I'm really happy we were able to quickly react to a major European event, which was a Dutch election. There's a lot to be said. I'm happy we're covering the Netherlands because the Netherlands, as we said, has usually been considered as one of the kind of smaller countries, and the the biggest of the small countries is now it's kind of the smallest of the big countries. They kind of changed status over the past 5 years, especially since Brexit. Um, I think there's one thing which I find really fascinating. I'm French. My political system does not allow coalitions, but I find there's something so very fun about building a coalition on paper and see how we reach 50%. There's something kind of very mathematical and very for political junkies. I find it very fun to do. But what's interesting is the fact you have such a large scope of moderate parties does not mean it has increased governability. But if you look at the kind of electoral spectrum, you have 20% far left parties which aren't really in the running for coalition, and you've got 20% far right parties which are excluded from the coalition process. Maybe you are 21, but probably not. Which means out of the 60% remaining, you need to find somehow a 50% majority. So that's why you have months and months of negotiations. Now, I think the cordon sanitaire on the far right is much stronger than on the left. But still, that's a pretty impressive feat you have to do to be able to find a majority out of some kind of very small scope of the total electorate.
Yeah, the hidden variable here. I mean, there's a very important point there is that we tend to think of a country like Holland and its neighbors as this sort of end of history theater, right? Is this the idea that a lot of the old time sort of class conflicts, social conflicts have sort of faded and have given way to a new set of cleavages, right? Mostly around social and society issues, right? Like socially liberal versus socially conservative, with a big pension, with a big space for sort of fiscal debates. But what I thought was also interesting is it's not just that increased moderation does not equate with increased the ability the ease of governability, right? These coalitions are still having to be formed, and it's not an easy process, even though the Dutch public as a whole has greater congruence of views than in other European countries. It's also the fact that it's an incredibly splintered spectrum. There's a mosaic of parties, and that what comes with that is the difficulty of aligning all of these different egos and all of these different political careers and have them line up nicely in a government coalition where like all the cabinet is going to want to get behind a single agenda, and that's hugely that's hugely problematic sometimes. And I think they've mentioned towards the start some of that in the context of the child welfare scandal, where different ministers had different responsibilities in the scandal, where the government was accusing a huge spectrum of the population wrongly, but accusing it nonetheless of abusing child care benefits, child welfare benefits, I think. So yeah, definitely, a splintered political spectrum, a very protracted process of negotiations in order to form a government, and yet you have this prime ministerial, aura that still revolves around Mark Rutte and his ability to kind of bring the center right together on a fiscally conservative, socially liberal line, and kind of drive the country forward as a major player in the EU.
Yeah, I thought the idea that Simon presented, that essentially the Netherlands has been run by one large but maybe splintered centrist party, it makes me think of the way politics works in countries like South Korea or Japan, where there isn't the same kind of ruling party opposition dynamic. Rather, the kind of tensions are within one major dominant ruling party. I think there's something similar there. But speaking of coalitions, I also like the other comment he made about how the role of the Netherlands in the EU, because from a French perspective, when you think about Netherlands and the way they interact with other European member states, is often on fiscal integration. They end up being the bad cop and ending up being at odds with France, which is playing a bit more of a good cop role. And that is clear. I'm not sure that's going to change that much. D66 or not D66, I think that's here to stay. But what's interesting is the way the Netherlands function is very transactional, and I think that's something Rem made very clear. On different issues, you'll get different coalitions. On trade, you'll get coalition with French. On strategic autonomy, you'll get a coalition with the Spanish. I thought that's a really interesting concept. Actually, it's a fun pet project of mine I have on the side. I've place tested it a few times, but I'm developing a game simulating EU politics, in which you play a European member state coupled with a political party, kind of from anything between far right to far left. You've got a set of agendas on different issues: NATO, trade, immigration, and think of it as kind of a major tug of war on those 7 different issues. But what's interesting is, on some issues, the Netherlands and Poland will end up being loggerheads, but on other issues, will end up working together. Or same thing with France and Germany, or France and Italy. And I think that's something people have to understand in the way the EU functions. I think the Netherlands takes that to another level, which is on different issues, they'll create different coalitions. But the coalitions change all the time. South versus north, east versus west on different issues. And I think that's something you have to accept and understand. On some issues, you'll have to make coalitions with strange bedfellows, and I think that's the way EU politics works.
Yeah. And what I thought was also very interesting, which is almost doesn't even come naturally in these conversations, because it's obviously very endogenous fact that is very particular to the Dutch context, is the particular way they've dealt with migration, and not just the sort of the colonial migration that they've had, having been a pretty sizable empire with the Indonesian communities, and I think to a lesser extent the Dutch Antilles have also been a source of migrant inflows. But the way that the country has dealt with the Islamic influence, and some of these parallel pockets of Dutch society that have, I think we're still slated to have an episode in the not so distant future with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's obviously still, I think, a rather prominent figure in Dutch life. And I thought we didn't necessarily cover some of that, but that was implicit in our conversation around the hard right kind of coalitional politics. Anyhow, it was a pleasure, and thanks so much for tuning in. And catch you at another episode of Uncommon Decency.
See you next week.